I've always been a bit of a loner. Growing up, I didn't have many friends, but the ones I did have, I held on to tightly. That's why meeting Mark was such a big deal for me. He moved into the house next door when I was 10, and we hit it off right away. He was funny, smart, and always had these wild stories that captivated me. We did everything together, rode our bikes through the neighborhood, played video games for hours, and even camped out in our backyards, telling ghost stories under the stars. Mark had this uncanny ability to make even the most mundane activities seem exciting. But looking back, there were always strange things about him that I ignored. Mark was stronger than any kid I knew. Once, when we were 12, we found an old rusty bike in the woods. It must have weighed a ton, but Mark lifted it like it was nothing. He laughed it off, saying he had been working out, but it didn't make sense. I shrugged it off because I wanted to believe him. He was my best friend after all. Then there were his eyes. They were a dark, almost pitch black color. I'd never seen eyes like that before, and when he got angry or excited, they seemed to glimmer in a way that sent shivers down my spine. But again, I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. As the years passed, I noticed other strange things. Mark never seemed to get sick, never missed a day of school, and his appetite was insatiable. During sleepovers, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him staring out the window, muttering to himself in a language I didn't understand. I never confronted him about it. Fear, maybe, or denial. It wasn't until we were 17 that things started to spiral out of control. One evening, after a particularly intense argument with his parents, Mark showed up at my house, his face flushed with anger. His eyes were almost glowing in the dim light of my porch. He asked if he could stay the night, and of course I said yes. That night I had the worst nightmares. I dreamt of being chased by something monstrous through a dark, endless forest. When I finally woke up, drenched in sweat, I saw Mark standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with those eerie eyes. He told me everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the days went by, Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, and when he came back, he was different, distant, almost predatory. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd brush me off, saying I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining it. The day I found the mutilated carcass of a deer in the woods behind our houses, I knew something was horribly wrong. The wounds were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and the air around it smelled of decay and something else, something primal and terrifying. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew. Mark was no ordinary friend. He was something else entirely, something ancient and deadly. And by the time I realized it, it was already too late. I couldn't shake the image of the mutilated deer from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its lifeless body, the torn flesh, and those deep, gaping wounds. My thoughts kept circling back to Mark and his strange behavior. I needed to know the truth. One night, I decided to follow him. He had been disappearing more frequently, and I was determined to find out where he was going. I waited until he slipped out of his house, moving silently like a shadow. He headed toward the forest, and I kept a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper we went into the woods, the darker it became. The moonlight barely pierced through the dense canopy, and I struggled to keep up without making any noise. Mark seemed to know exactly where he was going, navigating the twisted paths with ease. After what felt like hours, we reached a clearing. I hid behind a large tree, peeking out just enough to see him. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old, dilapidated cabin. I'd never seen it before, and I'd spent years exploring these woods. Mark approached the cabin and entered without hesitation. I waited a few minutes before creeping closer. The air around the cabin was thick with an oppressive, unsettling energy. I couldn't hear anything from inside, but I knew I had to see what was happening. I found a small window at the back of the cabin and peered inside. What I saw chilled me to the bone. Mark stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by strange symbols drawn on the floor. His eyes were closed, and he was chanting in that same unfamiliar language I'd heard him mutter before. Suddenly, his body began to convulse, and he fell to his knees. I watched in horror as his skin rippled and shifted, his features distorting in ways that defied logic. It was as if his human form was a mask, and something monstrous was trying to break free. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Mark was changing, transforming into something hideous and inhuman. I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. I forced myself to move, tripping over roots and branches as I fled back to the safety of my house. When I finally burst through my front door, my parents looked at me with concern. I must have been a sight, pale, shaking, and covered in dirt. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. They thought I was just having a bad dream. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept seeing Mark's distorted face in my mind, those black eyes staring into my soul. I knew I had to confront him, to understand what he was and what he wanted. The next day, I went to his house. His parents told me he wasn't home and didn't know when he'd be back. They seemed on edge, like they were hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. Days turned into weeks and Mark didn't come back. I was left alone with my fears and suspicions. I started researching everything I could about monsters, shapeshifters, and ancient folklore. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Mark was something old, something dangerous. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my window. I looked out and saw Mark standing there, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He motioned for me to follow him. Despite my fear, I knew I had to go. This was my chance to get answers. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of the house. Mark led me back into the woods, to the same clearing with the cabin. This time I wasn't hiding. I was ready to face whatever truth awaited me inside. As we entered the cabin, the air grew colder. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, and Mark turned to face me, his expression unreadable. He told me that he had something to show me, something that would change everything I thought I knew. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien, he began to speak. Mark's voice was a haunting mix of familiarity and strangeness, sending chills down my spine. His words were heavy with an ancient resonance, and I felt a deep sense of foreboding as he began to speak. "You have to understand," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "I am not what you think I am. My family, our history, it's all tied to something much older and darker than you can imagine." I stood there, frozen, as he explained his true nature. Mark was an ogre, a creature of myth and nightmare. His family had been living among humans for centuries, hiding their true selves, blending in. They had rituals like the one I had witnessed, to keep their monstrous forms at bay, to maintain the illusion of humanity. But something had gone wrong. The ritual was failing and Mark was losing control. The strange occurrences, the mutilated deer, his erratic behavior, it all made sense now. He was struggling to contain the beast within. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But it's getting harder to keep it in. I need your help." My mind was racing. How could I help him? What could I possibly do to stop this ancient curse? Before I could ask, Mark handed me a worn, leather-bound book. It was filled with symbols, incantations, and drawings of creatures that sent a shiver down my spine. "This book has been in my family for generations," he explained. "It contains everything we know about our kind and how to control it. I need you to help me perform the ritual again. We can do it together." I hesitated, fear gripping my heart. But Mark was my best friend. Despite everything, I couldn't abandon him. I nodded, taking the book from his hands. Together, we began to prepare for the ritual. The process was intricate and unnerving. We gathered rare herbs, drew symbols on the floor with chalk, and chanted in that strange ancient language. The air grew thick with an otherworldly energy, and I could feel the presence of something powerful watching us. As we began the final incantation, Mark's body convulsed, his face contorting in pain. I kept chanting, my voice trembling but steady. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter and the air crackled with energy. I could see the beast within Mark fighting to break free, but I pushed on, driven by a desperate hope. Finally, with one last powerful chant, the energy exploded and Mark collapsed to the floor. The cabin fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding. Mark's eyes fluttered open and he looked at me with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice weak but human. "I think it worked." I helped him to his feet and we stumbled out of the cabin exhausted but hopeful. As we walked back through the forest, Mark told me more about his family's history, their struggles to maintain their humanity, and the constant battle against their monstrous nature. For a moment, it seemed like everything might be okay. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The ritual might have bought us some time, but the darkness that lurked within Mark was far from vanquished. The true horror was yet to come. As we reached the edge of the woods, I looked back at the dark silhouette of the cabin. I had a sinking feeling that our fight against the ancient curse was far from over. And as much as I wanted to believe we could overcome it, a voice in the back of my mind whispered that the worst was still to come. The days following the ritual were a blur of anxiety and dread. Mark seemed better, more like his old self, but the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living on borrowed time, that the beast within him was merely biding its time. Then one night, the nightmares returned. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I had dreamt of the cabin again, of Mark transforming into a monstrous ogre, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I decided to check on Mark. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped out of the house. The night was eerily silent, the air heavy with tension. As I approached Mark's house, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was him. He was standing in the middle of the street, staring up at the moon. "Mark," I called out softly, but he didn't respond. I moved closer, my heart pounding. As I reached him, I noticed his eyes. They were pitch black, shimmering in the moonlight. "Mark, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to face me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. I don't know," he whispered. "It's getting harder to control. The beast, it's stronger than before." Panic surged through me. The ritual had only been a temporary fix. We needed to find a permanent solution, and fast. I helped Mark back to his house, his body trembling with the effort to keep the beast at bay. The next morning, I skipped school to do more research. I scoured the internet, old books, anything that might give us a clue. Hours turned into days, and I was growing more desperate with each passing moment. Mark's condition was deteriorating, and I could see the fear in his eyes. One evening, as I was poring over an old tome about ancient curses and rituals, I found something. It was a passage about a powerful amulet, said to be able to bind and contain even the most fearsome of creatures. The amulet was called the Heart of Gorgon, and according to the text, it was hidden in a long-forgotten temple deep within the forest. I rushed to Mark's house, the book clutched in my hands. "I think I found something," I said, breathless with excitement. "There's an amulet, the Heart of Gorgon. It might be able to help you." Mark's eyes lit up with hope. "Where is it?" "It's in an old temple in the forest," I explained. "We have to find it." We wasted no time. That night, armed with flashlights and determination, we ventured into the woods. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and eerie sounds, but we pressed on, driven by the need to save Mark. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Just when we were about to give up, we stumbled upon it. A crumbling, moss-covered temple hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees. The air around it was thick with an ancient, almost malevolent energy. We entered cautiously, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The inside of the temple was a maze of corridors and chambers, each more foreboding than the last. Finally, we found it, the Heart of Gorgon. It was a large, intricately carved amulet, pulsing with a faint, otherworldly glow. As I reached out to take it, a sense of dread washed over me. I could feel the power emanating from the amulet, a power that could either save Mark or doom us both. I picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through my body. "Let's get out of here," Mark said, his voice filled with urgency. We made our way back through the temple, but as we neared the exit, a low growl echoed through the corridors. My heart stopped. Something was in there with us. We ran, the sound of footsteps and growls growing closer behind us. Just as we burst out of the temple, a massive, shadowy figure lunged at us. It was a monstrous creature, its eyes glowing with a fierce, predatory light. We sprinted through the forest, the beast hot on our heels. Somehow we made it back to the safety of our neighborhood, the creature stopping at the edge of the woods as if bound by some invisible barrier. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, the Heart of Gorgon still clutched in my hand. We had the amulet, but I knew the true battle was only beginning. The beast within Mark was growing stronger, and we were running out of time. The Heart of Gorgon might be our last hope, but using it would come with a cost. And deep down, I feared that we might not be ready to pay it. The discovery of the Heart of Gorgon gave us a sliver of hope, but it also brought new fears. The amulet pulsed with an eerie energy, and I could feel its power coursing through my veins. Mark and I knew we had to act quickly before his transformation became irreversible. The book that had led us to the amulet also contained instructions for a ritual of binding. This ritual, when performed correctly, would use the amulet's power to bind the beast within Mark, suppressing its influence permanently. The ritual was complex and dangerous, but it was our only chance. We gathered the necessary ingredients: rare herbs, candles, and a dagger inscribed with ancient runes. The ritual had to be performed at midnight under the full moon. As the hour approached, we made our way back to the clearing in the woods, the site of the previous ritual. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. We drew the intricate symbols on the ground with chalk, placing the candles at precise intervals around the circle. Mark stood in the center, his face pale but resolute. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the constant battle against the beast within. I placed the heart of Gorgon on the ground before him and took a deep breath. "Are you ready?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark nodded. "We have to do this. It's the only way." I began to chant the incantation, my voice steady despite the terror gnawing at my insides. The candles flickered, their flames dancing in the night air. As the chant grew louder, the amulet began to glow, its light intensifying with each passing moment. Mark's body tensed, his eyes closing as he concentrated on the ritual. The air around us crackled with energy, the symbols on the ground glowing with an otherworldly light. I could feel the power of the amulet pulling at the beast within Mark, struggling to contain it. Suddenly, Mark let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing. I fought the urge to stop, knowing that breaking the ritual could be disastrous. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew colder, the shadows around us deepening. The amulet's glow intensified, and I could see the beast within Mark fighting back, its dark energy clashing with the light of the heart of Gorgon. Mark's screams echoed through the forest, but I kept chanting, pouring every ounce of my will into the ritual. With a final thunderous roar, the beast was pulled into the amulet. The ground stopped shaking and the air grew still. Mark collapsed, the light of the candles fading to a soft glow. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding. "Mark, are you okay?" I whispered, fear gripping my heart. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment I saw the boy I had grown up with, the friend I had known for so long. I think it worked," he said, his voice weak but human. "I can't feel the beast anymore." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a nagging doubt. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? The heart of Gorgon pulsed faintly, its power diminished but still potent. I knew we had succeeded in binding the beast, but the amulet was a double-edged sword, its power both a blessing and a curse. As we made our way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that our victory was temporary. The beast might be contained, but the ancient curse that had plagued Mark's family for generations was far from defeated. We had bought ourselves some time, but the darkness still lurked in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. And as we reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time, a chill running down my spine. The battle was far from over, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. In the days following the ritual, life seemed to return to a semblance of normalcy. Mark and I went back to school, hung out at our usual spots, and even managed to laugh again. The tension that had gripped us for so long was finally starting to ease. Mark's eyes were brighter, his demeanor lighter, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had my best friend back. But beneath the surface, the shadows still lingered. The heart of Gorgon now sat in my room, its faint pulse a constant reminder of the battle we had fought and the darkness we had barely contained. Every night I'd catch myself staring at it, wondering if we had truly succeeded or merely postponed the inevitable. Mark's parents seemed relieved, but there was a wariness in their eyes that mirrored my own fears. They knew as well as I did that the beast's influence might be suppressed but never truly eradicated. The ancient curse was a part of Mark, and we could never be sure when it might resurface. Then one evening, as we were hanging out in my room, Mark brought up something that had been bothering him. "Do you ever wonder what's really inside that amulet?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the heart of Gorgon. I glanced at the amulet, its surface reflecting the dim light of my room. "I try not to think about it," I admitted. "But yeah, sometimes, it's like it's still alive somehow." Mark nodded, a troubled look on his face. I've been having dreams, weird ones. In them I see the beast, but it's not angry or violent. It's calling to me, like it wants to show me something. A chill ran down my spine. You think it's trying to communicate with you? I don't know, Mark said, running a hand through his hair. But it feels important, like there's something we're missing. His words stirred a deep unease within me. The amulet had saved him, but its power was ancient and mysterious. We had used it to bind the beast, but what if it had its own agenda? What if the beast was trying to break free again? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mark's dreams, the strange connection he seemed to have with the beast. As the hours ticked by, my mind conjured up dark scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. In the early hours of the morning, I heard a noise outside my window. I got up and looked out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Mark standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. I had another dream, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was clearer this time. The beast showed me a place deep in the forest near the old ruins. I think we need to go there. My instinct was to refuse, to tell him it was too dangerous. But I knew Mark, and I could see the determination in his eyes. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until we faced it head on. We set out at dawn, the first light of day barely piercing the thick canopy of the forest. Mark led the way, his steps sure despite the ominous atmosphere. As we ventured deeper, the air grew colder, the trees more twisted and gnarled. Eventually, we reached a clearing I had never seen before. In the center stood a circle of ancient stones, their surfaces covered in moss and strange weathered symbols. The place exuded an eerie energy, a feeling of being watched. Mark stepped forward, his eyes scanning the stones. This is it. This is where the beast wanted me to come. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. I could feel the heart of Gorgon pulsing in my backpack, its energy resonating with the stones. Suddenly, Mark's body tensed and he let out a gasp. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed to the ground, convulsing violently. Panic surged through me as I rushed to his side, unsure of what to do. As Mark lay there, his body writhing, I felt a presence, something ancient and powerful. The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the stones around us glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. In that moment, I realized that the calm we had experienced was merely the eye of the storm. The true battle was about to begin, and the darkness we had fought to contain was far from finished with us. And as the shadows closed in, I knew that our fight for survival had only just begun. Mark's convulsions intensified, his body thrashing violently on the ground. I tried to hold him down to keep him from hurting himself, but it was like trying to control a force of nature. The ancient stones around us pulsed with light, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. "Mark, hold on," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the rising wind. "We're going to get through this." His eyes snapped open, and for a moment they were completely black, filled with an unfathomable darkness. Then, just as suddenly, they returned to normal, and he went still. I checked his pulse, my hands trembling, and found it weak but steady. I glanced around, my heart pounding. The stone's glow had faded, but the oppressive energy remained, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I knew we couldn't stay there. We had to get Mark to safety. With a great effort, I managed to lift him onto my shoulder. He was surprisingly light, his body almost limp. I started the arduous journey back through the forest, every step filled with dread. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of my labored breathing and Mark's shallow breaths. As we neared the edge of the woods, Mark stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "What? What happened?" he asked weakly. "We found the place from your dream," I explained, relief washing over me. "You collapsed, but I think you're going to be okay." He nodded, too exhausted to speak. We finally reached the edge of the forest and made our way back to my house. I helped Mark inside and laid him on the couch, grabbing a blanket to cover him. He fell into a deep sleep almost immediately, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. I sat beside him, my mind racing. The stones in the clearing had reacted to Mark's presence, and the heart of Gorgon had pulsed with energy. Something profound had happened, and I needed to understand it. I grabbed the old tome and began to search for any mention of the ancient stones or the clearing. Hours passed, and my eyes were burning from fatigue when I finally found a reference. The passage described a sacred site, a place where ancient rituals had been performed to bind powerful entities. The stones were a conduit, amplifying the energy of those who stood within the circle. But the text also contained a warning. Disturbing the balance of the site could awaken something dark and ancient. My heart sank as I realized that our actions might have done just that. Mark woke up as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows. He looked stronger, more alert. "I feel different," he said, sitting up slowly, like something inside me has shifted. I told him about the passage I had found, about the ancient site and its power. He listened intently, his expression growing more serious. "If we disturb something, we need to find out what, and we need to fix it before it's too late." Over the next few days, we focused on gathering more information. We visited local libraries, pored over old maps, and even talked to a few elderly townsfolk who remembered stories of the forest's dark history. Piece by piece, we started to uncover a chilling narrative. The clearing was once the site of a great battle between ancient guardians and a malevolent entity. The guardians had managed to bind the entity within the stones, using their combined power to seal it away. But the balance was delicate, and any disruption could weaken the bindings. Mark and I realized with growing horror that our ritual, and Mark's connection to the beast, might have weakened the seals. The dreams Mark had been experiencing were likely a form of communication from the entity, a way to lure him to the site and exploit his power. We knew we had to act quickly. The entity was still bound, but the weakening seals meant it could break free if given the chance. We needed to perform a new ritual, one that would restore the balance and reinforce the bindings. As we prepared for the new ritual, the forest seemed to grow darker, the air thicker with a sense of impending doom. Mark's dreams became more intense, filled with visions of the entity's power and its desire for freedom. The night of the ritual, we returned to the clearing, the ancient stones looming ominously in the moonlight. We set up the candles and symbols, following the instructions from the book with meticulous care. The heart of Gorgon pulsed with a steady, reassuring glow, its power ready to be harnessed. Mark stood in the center of the circle, his face determined. "Whatever happens, we have to see this through," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, my heart pounding. "We will. We have to." As we began the chant, the air around us crackled with energy. The symbols on the ground glowed, and the stones pulsed with light. Mark's body tensed, his eyes closing as he concentrated. Then, the ground began to shake, and a low, menacing growl echoed through the clearing. The entity was fighting back, resisting our efforts to bind it once more. Mark's face contorted with pain, but he kept chanting, his voice growing louder, more powerful. The wind howled, and the forest seemed to come alive with shadows. I could see the entity's dark form swirling around us, its eyes glowing with malice. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. With a final, desperate effort, Mark raised the heart of Gorgon high above his head. The amulet's light intensified, and the entity let out a piercing shriek. The ground shook violently, and I felt a surge of energy pass through me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The air grew still, the shadows receded, and the stone's glow faded. Mark collapsed to the ground, the heart of Gorgon falling from his grasp. I rushed to his side, my heart in my throat. "Mark, are you okay?" He opened his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "I think we did it. The balance is restored." Relief washed over me, but I knew our victory was fragile. The entity was bound once more, but the ancient curse still lingered, a constant threat. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As we made our way back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still watching, waiting for its next chance to strike. And as I looked at the heart of Gorgon, I knew that our fight against the ancient curse was far from finished. The following days were a blur of exhaustion and recovery. Mark and I barely spoke about the ritual, each of us lost in our thoughts and fears. The entity was bound, but we both knew the curse was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a faint tapping at my window. I sat up, my heart racing, and saw Mark standing outside. His expression was grim, his eyes filled with worry. I opened the window and let him in. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice hushed. "It's happening again," Mark said, his voice trembling. "The dreams. They're worse than before." A chill ran down my spine. What do you see? Mark sat down on the edge of my bed, running a hand through his hair. I see the entity, but it's different now. It's not just calling to me, it's angry. It feels like it's trying to break free. Fear gnawed at me. But we restored the balance. We used the heart of Gorgon. How can it still be trying to escape? Mark shook his head. I don't know, but I can feel it growing stronger. It's like it's feeding off my fear. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. I knew we couldn't face this alone. We needed help. Someone who understood the ancient curse and the power of the entity. The next day, we decided to visit the town's historian, Mrs. Blackwood. She was known for her knowledge of local legends and folklore, and if anyone could help us, it would be her. Mrs. Blackwood's house was a quaint, old-fashioned cottage at the edge of town. The garden was overgrown with wildflowers, and the air was thick with the scent of herbs. We knocked on the door, and after a moment she appeared, her eyes sharp and curious. "Mark, Sam, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with concern. "We need your help," I said, explaining everything that had happened, from the discovery of the heart of Gorgon to the recent dreams. Mrs. Blackwood listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When we finished, she sighed and gestured for us to sit. "You've stumbled upon something very old and very dangerous," she said, her voice low. "The entity you speak of is known in ancient texts as the Wraith of the Abyss. It was bound long ago by powerful guardians, but its influence never truly vanished. Is there any way to stop it for good?" Mark asked, his voice filled with desperation. Mrs. Blackwood nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it is perilous. The Wraith draws its strength from the fear and darkness within the human soul. To defeat it, you must confront it directly, face your deepest fears, and reject its power." The idea of facing the Wraith terrified me, but I knew we had no choice. "How do we confront it?" I asked. Mrs. Blackwood stood and walked over to a dusty bookshelf, pulling out an old leather-bound tome. She opened it to a page filled with intricate symbols and handed it to us. "This is a ritual of confrontation. It will draw the Wraith into the physical realm, where you can face it. But be warned, the ritual requires immense strength of will. If you falter, the Wraith will consume you." Mark and I exchanged a look, determination and fear mirrored in our eyes. "We'll do it," Mark said firmly. "We have to." Mrs. Blackwood nodded. "Prepare yourselves. You will need to gather the same ingredients you used for the binding ritual, but you must also add a personal item, something that holds deep emotional significance for each of you. This will help anchor your resolve." We thanked Mrs. Blackwood and left, the weight of the impending confrontation heavy on our shoulders. That evening, we gathered the ingredients, each of us selecting a personal item for the ritual. I chose a locket that had belonged to my grandmother, while Mark selected a worn leather bracelet his father had given him. As midnight approached, we returned to the clearing in the forest. The air was thick with anticipation, the ancient stones looming ominously in the moonlight. We set up the ritual circle, placing the candles and symbols with meticulous care. The heart of Gorgon pulsed with a steady, reassuring glow, its power ready to be harnessed once more. Mark and I stood in the center of the circle, our personal items in hand. We began to chant the incantation, our voices steady despite the terror gnawing at our insides. The candles flickered, their flames dancing in the night air. The symbols on the ground glowed, and the air around us crackled with energy. As the chant grew louder, the ground began to shake, and a low, menacing growl echoed through the clearing. The Wraith was being drawn into the physical realm, its presence palpable and suffocating. The air grew colder, and the shadows around us deepened, twisting into nightmarish shapes. Mark's face contorted with pain, but he kept chanting, his voice growing louder, more powerful. I felt a surge of energy pass through me, the heart of Gorgon's light intensifying. Suddenly, the Wraith materialized before us, a towering figure of darkness and malice. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, predatory light, and its form shifted and twisted, as if made of living shadows. "Face your fears," Mrs. Blackwood's words echoed in my mind. "Reject its power." I focused on the locket in my hand, memories of my grandmother flooding my mind. I remembered her strength, her love, and her unwavering resolve. Drawing on those memories, I steeled myself against the Wraith's malevolent presence. Mark did the same, clutching his bracelet and summoning his own inner strength. Together we faced the Wraith, our resolve unwavering. The Wraith lunged at us, its form shifting into monstrous shapes, each more terrifying than the last. But we stood our ground, our voices steady as we chanted the final words of the incantation. The heart of Gorgon's light flared, and the Wraith let out a piercing shriek. The ground shook violently, and a surge of energy erupted from the amulet, enveloping the Wraith in a blinding light. For a moment, everything went still. The air grew silent, and the shadows receded. When the light faded, the Wraith was gone, its presence banished from the physical realm. Mark and I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but triumphant. We had faced our deepest fears and emerged victorious. The Wraith's power was broken, its influence banished, and the ancient curse finally lifted. As we made our way back home, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The battle was over, and the darkness that had haunted us for so long was finally vanquished. But deep down, I knew that the memories of our ordeal would stay with us forever, a reminder of the strength we had found within ourselves, and the bonds of friendship that had carried us through the darkest of times. In the aftermath of our confrontation with the Wraith, life began to settle into a new normal. Mark and I returned to school, our bond stronger than ever. The weight of the curse that had haunted his family for generations had finally been lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we allowed ourselves to hope for a brighter future. But the scars of our ordeal were slow to heal. The nights were still filled with restless dreams, and every shadow seemed to hold a trace of the darkness we had fought. Mark and I kept the heart of Gorgon safe, hidden away in a secure box, a symbol of both our victory and the lingering danger. A few weeks after the ritual, we decided to visit Mrs. Blackwood to thank her for her help and seek advice on what to do with the amulet. Her home, with its overgrown garden and comforting scent of herbs, felt like a sanctuary. As we sat in her cozy living room sipping tea, Mrs. Blackwood studied us with a keen eye. "You've been through a great ordeal," she said softly, "but you've emerged stronger. The Wraith is banished, but you must remain vigilant. Such dark forces have a way of leaving echoes." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "We've been having strange dreams. Not as intense as before, but unsettling. Do you think it's still trying to reach us?" Mrs. Blackwood considered this for a moment. "The Wraith's power is broken, but its influence might still linger. It's not uncommon for those who have faced such darkness to be haunted by its remnants. But these dreams could also be your mind's way of processing the trauma." I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. "What should we do with the heart of Gorgon? It's powerful, and I'm worried it could attract other dark forces." Mrs. Blackwood's gaze softened. "You're right to be cautious. The amulet's power is great, and while it has served its purpose, it's not without danger. There are places where such artifacts can be kept safe, away from those who might misuse them." She told us of a secret society dedicated to safeguarding ancient relics and protecting the world from dark forces. They had vaults designed to contain and neutralize powerful artifacts like the heart of Gorgon. It seemed like the best option to ensure the amulet wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. With Mrs. Blackwood's help, we contacted the society. They agreed to take the amulet into their care, arranging for a discreet transfer. The day we handed over the heart of Gorgon was bittersweet. It had saved Mark and bound us together in a way nothing else could, but it was also a constant reminder of the darkness we had faced. As we watched the society's representative carefully pack the amulet away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was like closing a chapter of our lives, one filled with terror and triumph. The weeks turned into months, and slowly the shadows of the past began to fade. Mark and I focused on our studies, on rebuilding a sense of normalcy. The dreams became less frequent, and the sense of foreboding that had hung over us lightened. One afternoon, as we sat in the park, enjoying the warmth of the sun, Mark turned to me. "Do you ever wonder what's next? I mean, after everything we've been through, it feels like we're meant for something more." I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "I think we are. We've faced things most people can't even imagine. Maybe it's our job to make sure others don't have to." Mark nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. "We could help people, like Mrs. Blackwood does. use what we've learned to protect others. And so a new purpose began to take shape. We started to train, to study more about ancient curses, dark entities, and the rituals that could protect against them. Mrs. Blackwood became our mentor, guiding us as we prepared to face whatever might come next. The memories of our battle with the Wraith were still there, but they no longer held us captive. Instead, they fueled our resolve, reminding us of our strength and the bonds that had carried us through the darkest of times. As the seasons changed, so did we. The horrors of the past had forged us into something stronger, more resilient. And as we stood on the threshold of a new chapter, we knew that whatever shadows lay ahead, we would face them together. As the months passed, Mark and I delved deeper into our new calling. Under Mrs. Blackwood's mentorship, we learned about ancient artifacts, rituals, and the dark forces that once plagued the world. It was a different kind of education, one that required both intellectual and emotional strength. We were often invited to speak at local gatherings, sharing our experiences in a way that offered both caution and hope. Our story became a legend of sorts, a tale of bravery and resilience that inspired others. But as we shared our knowledge, we also became aware of new, unsettling occurrences. One night, while researching in my room, I noticed something peculiar. A faint whispering sound filled the air, barely audible but persistent. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a chilling reminder of the darkness we had once faced. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the room was empty. I took a deep breath and tried to ignore it, chalking it up to fatigue. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, and I could no longer dismiss them as mere tricks of the mind. One evening, while discussing these disturbances with Mark, we decided to investigate. Armed with our knowledge and protective tools, we ventured into the woods where the Wraith had been bound. The clearing, once a site of terror, now felt oddly serene, as if the land itself was healing. We set up our equipment and began to perform a series of protective rituals, hoping to discern whether the disturbances were merely echoes of our past ordeal or something more sinister. The clearing was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. As we worked, Mark's face grew pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. "I feel it," he whispered. "The whispers, they're stronger here." I nodded, my own senses tingling with unease. It's like something is lingering, waiting for a chance to break free. Suddenly the ground trembled, and a deep guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The temperature dropped and a dense fog rolled in, enveloping us in an eerie mist. Shadows danced in the periphery of our vision, and the whispers grew louder, forming disjointed words and phrases. The heart of Gorgon, which we had brought with us for protection, pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, its light flickering in the darkness. I held it tightly, feeling its power resonate with the energy around us. The fog thickened, and through the swirling mist we saw a figure emerge, a dark, shadowy form that seemed to waver and shift. It was not the Wraith, but something akin to its essence, a remnant of its dark presence. Mark and I stood our ground, our voices steady as we recited the protective incantations. The shadows writhed and hissed, but we continued, our resolve unwavering. The figure advanced, its form taking on a more defined shape. It was a grotesque amalgamation of fear and malice, a manifestation of the lingering darkness that had once been bound. The heart of Gorgon's light flared, pushing back against the shadowy entity. With a final powerful chant, we invoked a binding spell, channeling the heart of Gorgon's energy. The figure let out a bone-chilling scream as it was drawn back into the darkness, the fog dissipating and the ground ceasing its tremors. Panting and exhausted, we surveyed the clearing. The oppressive energy had lifted, and the air felt lighter. But the encounter had left us shaken. It was clear that while the Wraith was bound, its influence had left lingering echoes that could still manifest. We returned to Mrs. Blackwood, who listened to our account with a grave expression. "The remnants you encountered are a sign that the Wraith's influence was more pervasive than we realized. Its defeat was a victory, but its dark energy has left a lasting mark." She handed us an ancient book, its cover embossed with intricate symbols. "This contains further guidance on dealing with lingering darkness. Use it wisely and remember that vigilance is crucial." Mark and I took the book, our sense of duty reaffirmed. The battle against the shadows was far from over, but we were better equipped now, both in knowledge and spirit. We knew that our journey was not just about fighting the darkness, but also understanding it. ensuring that it never again threatened the world we cherished. As we left Mrs. Blackwood's home, the weight of our responsibility was heavy but familiar. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with unknown challenges and hidden dangers, yet we faced it with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that together we could confront whatever shadows lay in wait. The echoes of darkness might linger, but so did our resolve. And as we stepped into the twilight, ready to face the next chapter of our lives, we carried with us the lessons of the past and the hope for a future free of fear.